Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Around the Bird Bath. As always, I'm your host, Dan Nerdahl, and coming to you with the second to last weekend preview of the regular season. Have plans with Jared and Adrian to do a conference tournament preview again, similar to last year, but as far as the regular season, it's coming to a close. Have this weekend against South Florida at home, final home series of the regular season. That will be followed up by the final Tuesday game at home against UIW. And then the team will travel to Boca Raton, Florida. It will be a Thursday through Saturday series against Florida Atlantic. And all teams will wrap up on Saturday with conference tournament play starting soon. So the team will most likely stay in Florida. Yeah, I'm very confident that they'll stay in Florida because the tournament finishes on Saturday. The regular season finishes on Saturday, and then the tournament starts Tuesday in Clearwater. So they'll probably find a place to practice, maybe even get down to Clearwater a little early and get ready for the tournament. So by Saturday evening, should have the finalization of the Saturday of the FAU series, should have the finalization of seeds and who everyone plays, at least the first round and whatnot. A reminder that the top 8 teams make it in. But, in terms of series preview, this one is on the main feeds, a freebie, if you will. We dropped the Where Are They Now with Ryan Stacy on the Patreon. That took the place of, since there was no Tuesday game this week, we dropped that episode. Had a great conversation with Ryan. Check that out if you are a Patreon member. And so because we dropped that one on Patreon, decided to make this one a freebie. So if you haven't listened to these yet, this is just a quick preview of the team coming in, who UTSA is playing, that team's history just a little bit, if they have any history with UTSA, and then we touched briefly on how that team is doing so far in 2024, and then look at what they bring from the mound and from the plate. Speaking of Patreon, as a reminder, if you are a Patreon member at any level, you always get early access to any episode we drop, Patreon or not. The Patreon members always get a little bit of early access to those episodes. You can go in and either on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, there's a specific URL or code that you can put in basically that gives you that puts like the Patreon feed on that platform. So you get it right to your phone. You get access to the Patreon chat. And then you get the bonus episodes, of course, and a lot of good content during the football season that I've mentioned before, and Jared and Adrian, of course, will highlight again as we get closer to football season. But definitely want to give a big shout out before we cut over to the preview to our Board of Trustees members, Digiteek, John Outwell, Gary and Ruben representing the UTSA Bird Gang Tailgate, Ray Redding and Meet Me Apparel, Brandon Grell and the Grell Realty Group, Andy Elizalde and Proficient Benefit Solutions, Ian McClendon and Seeker LLC, Ryan Squires, Waterman Construction, Javon Townsend, VP of the DFW chapter of the UTSA Alumni Association, UTSA Annual Giving, Artisan Vapor and CBD, and Wayne Gonzalez and Runners Rising Project. And of course, our big money donors as well, Ben Tovar, the Bunch family, Zach Espericueta and the San Antonio Podcast Network, Alejandro Benavides, Jacob Cavazos, board president for the UTSA Alumni Association, John Nally, Brandon Padron, Rick Cortez of Rowdy Road Grillers, and Sumner McDaniel. So thank you as always for your support. Helps us bring more content to you, cover sports, more sports, bring in guests, special episodes, and provide coverage into UTSA athletics 12 months out of the year. So with that being said, let's take a quick Cumbia break, and we'll cut over to the preview and talk about the University of South Florida Bulls. So South Florida, they're a team that they've had, history in the past. They've had some recent history with regional appearances, even the super regional. They were in Conference USA from 1996 to 2005. Then they went to the Big East. They were there from 2006 to 2013. And then, of course, they joined the American Athletic Conference in 2014, and they've been there ever since. So in their history, they've got 14 regional appearances. Their most recent was 2021, and they actually went to the Super Regional that year. They got to regionals by winning the tournament, beat Central Florida in the championship 8-7. Then they won the Gainesville Regional down in Florida, where they beat the University of Florida. They beat the University of Miami, and they beat South Alabama to go to the Super Regional. So kind of a crazy, probably a wild regional. And you've got two mid-majors in the championship. So you don't always see, it's always interesting to see what the mid-majors do in the regionals. And often they get either the 3 or the 4 seed. So the odds are already kind of stacked against them a little bit. But imagine, you've got a historical program in Miami and Florida. Both of them get knocked out by mid-majors, and then South Florida prevails and goes to the Super. They would lose 2 straight games to Texas, the University of Texas, in the Super Regional. One of them was competitive. The other one got away from them a little bit. But so some recent history, and 9 of those times they made it to regionals by being an at-large bid. So really good RPI. One of the years their RPI was even 38. And if you're a longtime listener or deeply invested in UTSA baseball, you know why that number stands out a little bit. But a lot of times where their RPI helped them get into the regionals. And they've had some good years, but even in 2021 when they won the tournament and then put it all together, they finished 31-30 that year. So it just goes to show you the importance of playing good baseball at the right time, finding that momentum, and feeling good going into the tournament. There's some similarities there with how UTSA has played as of late. They went into the Rice weekend. They hadn't lost a series yet. They dropped the series against Rice, win an exciting Tuesday game against Texas State, and then drop the series against Wichita, and in a lot of ways don't look great. While doing that, had the doubleheader. One of them was a blowout loss. The other one was pretty low scoring late, and then Wichita had a big 7th inning, and that was kind of it for that. So, UTSA needs to use this weekend feeling good. Come out of this weekend feeling good, figure some things out, get back on the right path, because conference tournament is right around the corner. And we're going to talk about this in a minute as we kind of look at the conference again from a bird's eye view, but it kind of seems like anybody can beat anybody. ECU's kind of putting themselves at the top, but South Florida took a game against ECU in the series last weekend. It was kind of a weird game. South Florida got food poisoning Friday night, so Saturday's game was moved to Sunday. They played a doubleheader. The conference has some rules about doubleheaders on the final day of a weekend series in terms of not one of them being 7 innings. There was a rain delay that was 3 or 4 hours. ECU's coach was upset after the game about some things with just how the weekend was handled. ECU's pitching is a little shorthanded right now. But, USF took a game from them. And so the big takeaway is UTSA, can use this weekend, and we'll talk about how USF looks and why it might be a good opportunity to do that. But before we do that, no history with UTSA and USF. According to the record books, they've never played each other. This is the first matchup between the two teams. Mentioned a little bit already how USF did in 2021. Last year, they were 21-39, 7-17 in the American Athletic. Their RPI was 167. They finished 8th in the regular season, 8th in the tournament, but they did go 2-2 in the tournament. And speaking of ECU again, they actually beat ECU like in the first game of the tournament. I think it was game one, definitely day one. Beat them like 12-11 in 11 innings. It was crazy. And then they would run rule UCF in their next game, and then they faced ECU again on that top bracket or bottom bracket, however it was divided up, probably top bracket, assuming ECU was the number one seed, and lost 2 straight to ECU. And then ECU obviously would lose in the finals to Tulane. This year, coming to the season, and South Florida was like an interesting dynamic coming in because on the coaches poll, they placed 5 players on the preseason all-conference team, 1 pitcher and 4 position players. So that definitely caught my attention. And I remember even replying to Stieg, follow him on Twitter, Stieg Life. He covers South Florida, similar to how Alamo Audible does with UTSA. He's been on the podcast with Jared. I think when Jared did a summer preview series last summer, Jared had him on to talk about USF. Mentioned to Steve, like, South Florida really surprised me with how many guys they placed on that preseason all-conference poll. And so, but then even when you looked at how they were projected to finish 5th in the coaches poll and 6th in D1 baseball, there still wasn't something that lined up with them. And then you look at their record, they're 23-25, they're 9-12 in conference. They're in 7th place, but you've got a logjam of, just 3 games, similar to last weekend. 3 games separate the number 3 seed from the number 10 seed. 2 games separate the number 3 seed from the 9 seed. 9 seed would, of course, be first one out at the tournament. And just 1 game separates 3 through 6. And that's important because you get to that 4 seed. Now that 4 seed is on the same side as ECU. And, 5 and 6, you're playing teams close. That first game is a team much closer to you overall. But it shows, again, as we were talking about a minute ago, this conference is just beating each other up. Outside of ECU and UTSA was kind of left out of that for the first 5 weekends, and now the last 2 they've kind of fallen into that as well. But with South Florida, it definitely seems like their pitching is kind of the outlier or the contributing factor for. You've got these really good position players that were highly regarded early in the season, or before the season started, but then your record doesn't really reflect that, and it's the pitching that continues to struggle. So from the mound, 8th in ERA, and for comparison, as frustrated as you might be sometimes with UTSA's pitching, UTSA's 7th, and UTSA as a team ERA is actually half a run lower than South Florida's. So overall, South Florida's ERA as a team is 6.07. In conference-only games, it's a little higher even at 6.84. Matching these two up on paper, they've given up less hits than UTSA, but then they've allowed 27 more runs, 35 more walks, 23 more doubles. They've allowed 11 triples, which leads the conference. Well, that kind of tells me, because you play more games at home than on the road. Conference, it's pretty split. I think it's probably 5-5. Maybe there's a couple teams that's not the case, but I think for the most part it's 5-5. And so maybe South Florida's ballpark is just super hitter friendly because, they've got more doubles. And the other thing I'd say about that in terms of being a hitter friendly park with the gaps and how deep it gets in right center or left center, South Florida's not really getting hammered too much from a home run perspective. They've only given up 30 home runs. I think UTSA has given up close to 50, like 47 maybe. And, South Florida is one thing their pitching is good at. They've got 8 guys generating the ground ball more than 50% of the time, and they've turned 31 double plays. That's second in the conference, only to Rice. I do want to say, just as a slight disclaimer, I don't know if the conference stats are completely updated on the American website or how often those get updated, because for UTSA, it says that they've only hit into 13 ground ball double plays, but then the baseballcube.com, which I reference a lot for a lot of stats and just going down into the history books, the baseball cube says UTSA is hit into 22. So that's obviously a pretty significant difference. And, last weekend alone, UTSA hit into 5 double plays. So I would think that 22 number is a little closer to accurate. But the point remains, South Florida is limiting the home run ball. Another area that they kind of struggle in more than UTSA, walks per 9. They allow 4.49 walks per 9. UTSA only allows 3.61. And then USF's whip as a team, walks plus hits per innings pitched, 1.59. And that's a very high number in terms of that stat. Looking at their individual pitchers, it seems like they've only got 2 kind of consistent weekend starters. You look at their games started and their games appeared, and it's very close, if not, 13-13, maybe it's 11-12. But the thing about them is, UTSA gets a little bit of a break from the starters with an under 4 ERA, and Hunter Mink and Jack Siebert are the 2 consistent weekend starters. The third game and their midweek game, it looks like they kind of spread it out amongst some guys. They've got a handful of guys with 4 starts, 5 starts in 12, 13, 11 appearances. But, Mink and Siebert, they struggled a little bit from an ERA perspective. Their whips, Mink is 1.38, Siebert is 1.50. Now, Siebert, he was that 5th player. We talked about 4 position players being on the preseason all-conference list, and 1 pitcher. Siebert was the pitcher for South Florida that made that list. And, his numbers haven't really followed that up. He does have, both him and Mink have a pretty good strikeout to walk ratio, 3.27 for Mink and 3.17 for Siebert. Their home run to fly ball rate is around 10%. Siebert does kind of get a little, inconsistent with the wild pitches and the hit batters, whereas Mink has a much better K per 9. Mink's strikeouts per 9 is 10.18, and he's got 72 strikeouts overall, which is pretty good. There's obviously some individuals in the country, and then Trey Savage has over 100, but 72 strikeouts is nothing to shy about. Another interesting individual, and he's a reliever, Corey Kling, 1.42 ERA, 0.47 whip, but only 6 innings pitched and 6 appearances. So I don't know if Kling was injured at the start of the season. We're going to talk about that with one of their South Florida's infielders here in a minute. Or if they just use him real sparingly, like maybe clean up or just bring him in at the end of things. UTSA has some kind of like that. He's made a couple appearances, Anthony Giannetti, where I think he's got like an inning or 2 innings maybe, and he's pitched scoreless both times, but that's really all he's ever appeared in. So with Kling, if you see that name pop up, know that it's a small sample size, but he's got some very good numbers. There are other 2 bullpen guys to look out for. Riley Skeen, 15 innings pitched and 13 appearances. He's got a 12.91 hits per 9, so you can get a lot of hits off Skeen. Be patient, but he does have a 10.57 K per 9. So he throws strikes, which means the opportunity is there, but he also probably has some nasty stuff that he can mix in to maybe generate some swing and misses. Don't have specific swing and miss stats. I don't have any resources to provide that. But another one to look out for or keep an eye on, Joey Volini. Now, Volini has made 3 starts. He's had 12 appearances, 24 innings pitched, so kind of a couple innings, averaging 2 innings pitched per appearance. So, maybe he's been a bullpen guy. Maybe they're having him open a little bit, and maybe he opens on one of the weekend games to kind of get things rolling. A little bit of lower hits per 9 as Skeen at 8.62, but, still something to watch. But I think the goal should be taking advantage of a pitching staff that, isn't having the best season. And the bullpen can be kind of sporadic. I mentioned the 2 guys, but they're not going to be available all weekend, and they're not going to be available for a lot of innings based on the numbers they put out. So, UTSA, it's been frustrating the last couple of weekends with the hitting, but the opportunity is still there. And this is still a team that is hitting overall pretty solid. So a good opportunity to hit the refresh button, learn from the past 2 weekends, but move forward and look ahead to the remainder of the regular season going into conference play. As we wrap up with how USF looks from the plate, I'm going to do it a little different this weekend for this weekend's preview than I normally do. Numbers-wise, they're kind of comparable to UTSA. Like, UTSA still hits better as a team. But then, there's some stats that USF's a little better in. There's some stats that UTSA is a little better than, but South Florida is a team that can hit the ball well. Instead, than breaking all that down, I want to look at the 4 players on the preseason all-conference poll and look at the seasons that they're having. Because, quick math, that's half your lineup. And then one other player we're going to touch on just real briefly that wasn't on that list but is having a pretty good season is center fielder Jackson Mayo. So that's your 5th player. So over half your lineup are either were expected to be really good, and some of them are meeting that metric, some aren't. And then somebody else that wasn't on that list that's having a pretty good season plays center field. So kind of like a Mason Lytle situation. Mason Lytle comes in maybe a little under the radar, was hurt at Oregon, only really had the Sanjak stats to go off of because he had very limited time at Oregon, and Mason's been turning out a pretty good season. Hitting 373, slugging 627, 17 doubles, 10 home runs. So, those 4 players, second baseman Bobby Bozer, shortstop Eric Snow, and then outfielder Drew Butcher, and then DH Ben Rosenblum. So with Bozer and Snow playing the middle infield spots, and then Mayo, kind of the fifth person at center field, really solid middle infield up the middle. Catching their catcher, he's putting up good numbers too. The other thing about South Florida, one last thing about them as a team, it seems like their hitting is kind of like, or at least their run production is similar to UTSA last year, where you had 3 or 4 guys that were putting up super good numbers and kind of carrying the team a little bit, and then other numbers were kind of balancing out. Whereas this year, UTSA at times, they've had a couple guys that have throughout been pretty solid, but there's been spurts where somebody kind of comes up and puts the team on their back for a little bit. You have a weekend or 2 weekends where somebody that maybe hadn't been hitting the ball super well starts contributing in a big way. And so South Florida is kind of having a season like UTSA had last year hitting wise, and then UTSA is having a little bit different. But in each of these 4 guys, I think Bobby Bozer, second baseman, and Drew Butcher in outfield, like overall, are the 2 biggest contributors for South Florida. Bozer, his numbers are really good. 314 at the plate, so above 300 batting average. He's slugging 721, so his OPS is 1,088. Now the thing about Bozer, that's only in 23 games played, and I saw that, I was like, okay, so is that because of, like, did he start off really good and now he's hurt, or vice versa? And reached out to Stieg and asked him, and he said that Bozer was hurt at the start of the year. Couldn't exactly remember what the injury was. Thought maybe something with his arm or his wrist. But the point remains that whatever it was, Bozer's clearly fine and off to, since returning back, because, he's got about half as many games as everyone else. 10 home runs in 23 games played, 30 RBIs, and 27 strikeouts. So Bozer was on that list. Since returning from injury, it looks like he's having some solid numbers. Drew Butcher, the thing about Butcher, a 437 on base percentage, just hitting 299, but then he's got 40 walks and 16 doubles. So Butcher is somebody that's real patient at the plate, sees the ball really well, really good at drawing walks and getting on base. Eric Snow doesn't strike out a lot. Snow is somebody that maybe he's not reaching up to those expectations, those preseason expectations, just hitting 255, 350, and slugging 333, only 1 home run, but 18 RBIs, so still finds a way to bring in runs and help out the offense through that point. And then DH Ben Rosenblum was the 4th player on that list, and his on-base percentage is 426. So he's got as many RBIs as he does walks. And then the thing about Rosenblum, 19 stolen bases and only 3 caught stealing. And, as much as Mason Lytle was running early in the season, Lytle only has 14 stolen bases. He's got a better percentage, 14 for 15, whereas Rosenblum is 19 for 22. But definitely expect Rosenblum to test the catchers if he gets on base this weekend, or when he gets on base, rather. And then, mentioned him briefly already, Jackson Mayo, 8 home runs, 36 RBIs, 15 doubles. Wasn't on that preseason all-conference list, but one more piece of the puzzle that makes it interesting for USF and what they bring to the field. Keys to the weekend as we wrap up here. UTSA has to win this series. You got to hold on to that 2 seed. You got to find some momentum again. You got to get back on the winning ways. I feel most comfortable when you win Friday and you start off on a good note and you've already got the first one under your belt. Obviously, it's not ideal to go into Saturday not having a win, and would still like to find some consistency with the starters. Yuli is still pretty solid, having a pretty solid season since he came back. Had a little bit of a rockier game 1 on Saturday. Still went 5 innings, but got a little bit away from him towards the end there. And Robert Orlowski started the Tuesday game against Texas State and then didn't see him over the weekend. So not sure exactly if he's, if they're just trying to get him to work on some things or what's going on there. Daniel Garza is somebody that has had at some points, some consistent outings. And then Braylon Owens. Braylon went 6 1/3 in game 2 on Saturday, the series finale, and definitely had his best outing overall in terms of, he didn't put up a scoreless outing, but I think by maybe doubled how long his outings had been by going 6 1/3. So if Braylon can continue to turn that corner that we've seen the last couple times, that could be big. But for UTSA, winning the series is priority number 1 from a team perspective. Mentioned how close teams were. Interestingly enough, the only teams in the American that have a winning record or above 500, East Carolina, UTSA, and then Florida Atlantic is 2 games above 500. I'm sorry, Tulane is 4. Tulane is above 500 as well. I think Florida Atlantic was maybe below, and now they're back above. But so 4 teams above, but 2 of those teams just a couple games above, and then even UTSA just 7 games above 500. So very close standings. Still a lot of craziness that could ensue over the next and final 2 weekends. In terms of how to watch and what time the games are going to be at, all games, of course, will be on ESPN Plus if you can't make it out to the Bird Bath. Friday, you've got your pretty routine 6 o'clock start. Saturday, you've got your 2 o'clock start. It is going to be graduation and senior day. And the reason they're doing it on Saturday, I would believe, is because Sunday is Mother's Day. And just to accommodate travel and maybe get everyone out a little sooner, Sunday's game is scheduled right now for an 11 o'clock start. So that's a couple hours earlier than the typical 1 o'clock. And, maybe in the future they just move Sunday's start up to noon, especially when you're playing teams that have to fly home. And now they're playing more teams out of state, of course, with the American Athletic. But those are the game times. Of course, as always, pay attention to updates on Twitter through the UTSA Baseball's Twitter page. And pay attention to 1604 and I-10 interchange, as it seems like they're closing that down every weekend, so depending on where you're coming from. But we'll wrap it up, as now we're getting closer to 35 minutes. Thanks as always for listening. Thanks as always for your support. If you're at the Bird Bath this weekend, come over and say hi. And let's hope for some good baseball. Birds up.